Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, cut off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know good, Ann Camp? You're listening to the Ann Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Gibney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson, and the Windy City representative, the baddest brother above the Mason-Dixon line, my play cousin, the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. Now, Chris, the last episode, we kind of did different episodes. I know your interview went really well, and glad you got a chance to do that. My big question, though, today is, did you get a chance to see the eclipse?
I did. So we almost made the decision to drive to Indianapolis or Carbondale, because we were really close to places that had the 100% totality, but with a 4-month-old, that wasn't good. But we still had 96% in Chicago. So
wow.
It was a pretty fantastic sight.
Yeah, that's much more than we had. Now, did you have the special glasses on, or are you blind currently?
Neither. I did not go with my kids to their field trip to the museum because I had some other work stuff to do. So I didn't have the glasses. I had the kind of pinpoint viewer.
Okay.
So I saw the shadow, but the kids and Z, they got to see it with the glasses, and they had the film to take pictures, so they got to share those with me.
So you didn't want to chance it? You didn't want to just, kind of take your chances just so you could at least see it? Wouldn't that have been cool?
So I did actually look up at the sun a little bit, but you really couldn't see it.
So you didn't do it. All right.
You really couldn't see it. I'm going to have, at some point, I don't know, I got to get to the sermon, but an illustration, I took an illustration from it, because at 96% totality, it was still so bright that you really couldn't see the eclipse without the glasses.
Really?
And
so
that
at 96%, you still needed the glasses. You to even see it at all.
To see it at all. If you just look up at 96%, you don't see anything but light. So there's an illustration in there somewhere.
There's something. A pastor could take that and use it for sure. Yeah, well, along with the eclipse, Chris, was also all the conversation about conspiracy theories. So some people thought it was going to be the rapture. I know Marjorie Green Taylor said it was God speaking to us and that, telling us that we need to repent, which we do need to repent, but I don't know if she knew that this was, this was scheduled. So they knew this was coming. And then I was reading something in one of the headlines from Wired said that there was a far right conspiracy theorist that was basically claiming that elites will use the eclipse to control humanity, sway the presidential election, and everything else under the sun is basically what they were claiming on the far right. Did any of that stuff come to pass? Any credibility to any of that?
Not on my accounting. And I saw a lot of this stuff coming from big names and, just run-the-mill folks. And, I did try to put it in context for my little congregation. I think there is some majesty of God in how well tuned the creation is, right? The fact that you do know 200 years from now where the moon is going to be.
Yep.
I think, take that, give worship to God, and, let that be that. But, people are going to do what people do.
And here's the other thing. And I can't remember who said this. I want to give credit, but I can't remember the brother's name is. But, there was also an earthquake in New York and some other places. And some people were saying, I'm not saying that God could never speak through those things. I think they could happen. Earthquakes happen quite a bit, though, in different parts of the world. But what somebody was saying, and I'm sorry, guys, if you know who this is, shout them out. But somebody was saying that we need to stop making all our prophecies based on stuff that's really just kind of like North America centric or America centric. Like something happened in America, therefore God is telling the world this and that. It's kind of a myopic view of who God is and what he can do. But any thoughts on us saying, taking something small from America, maybe not small, but taking something that's happening in America and just making a prophecy for all of the world?
Yeah, I don't know who said that, but that's exactly what I think. Because earthquakes happen all the time. Eclipses happen not as infrequently as they happen in the United States, right? But we do, like, we put ourselves in the middle of everything, and it can be exhausting.
Yeah, and we probably aren't the only ones that do that, but it can very much lead us, I think, in the wrong direction, right? When we're not considering there's a whole rest of the world out there, and these things are happening there too. Be on the lookout for signs from God. There are signs out there, but also you probably should take that into consideration. Give yourself a little perspective. Yeah. As always, Chris, I want to give a shout out to all our patrons and supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that we talk about things that most folks aren't going to talk about on your normal political show. But we want to cover it. We want to cover it from a biblical framework. You might agree, you might disagree with our opinions, but we do try to give you kind of a biblical framework as we work it out. All right. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe, and be a patron. We're talking and we're giving you a couple segments right now, but our patrons who go on patreon.com/churchpolitics and give monthly get extra episodes. They get bonus episodes. So if you like what we're doing now, you only get more if you decide to join the movement. Everybody looks around and says, man, I wish things would change. But in order to help things change, you've got to support movements and groups that are trying to make a difference, especially when it comes to the body of Christ. So think about it. Think about helping us out. For those of you who are already patrons, we greatly appreciate you. So grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. And Chris, I first want to go to a story that I saw in the Free Press. And it was about NPR, the national public radio. And the article was from a guy named Yuri Berliner, who in the beginning, Chris, he kind of admitted that he's kind of your stereotypical liberal. He's worked at NPR for 25 years. He was a senior editor of the business desk, but he has some issues with the direction that NPR has gone in recently. He said, NPR has always had a liberal bent, but he said that liberal bent was mostly about being open-minded. However, in his article in the Free Press, he says today, those who listen to NPR or read its coverage online find something very different than just that open-minded ethos. They find the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the U.S. population. So just when you think of NPR, National Public Radio, you would want to think of something that is just giving you the news and everybody can kind of gather around that, and it's useful. And I listen to NPR from time to time, but I have noticed a change. And one of the things he says in the article, Chris, is that millions came to us for conversations that exposed them to voices around the country and around the world radically different from their own, engaging precisely because they were unguarded and unpredictable. And the numbers speak for themselves. So he's saying there has been a change, and I'll get into what happened at NPR and what he thinks caused the change. But listen to these numbers, which kind of shows that at least the audience thinks something has changed, or the audience itself has changed. Back in 2011, Chris, 26% of NPR's listeners described themselves as conservative. 23% described themselves as middle of the road, and 37% described themselves as liberal. By 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% of the audience described themselves as conservative, 21% described themselves as middle of the road, and 67% described themselves as very or somewhat liberal. That's a major change in about 12 years. And what he says was not only were they losing, what this shows is not only were they losing conservatives, they were losing moderates and traditional liberals. Now, we may need to get into the difference between a traditional liberal and a progressive. I think a lot of people use those interchangeably. I do sometimes, but there is a difference that we probably should talk about, but I'll get into that a little later. Bernliner says that this change has not only been devastating for journalism, but it's been devastating for NPR's business model. They've just lost a lot of people that don't come back because they don't think it's fair. He also believes that, and here's the big thing, because you might ask, Chris, the question you might want to ask is, when did this change occur? What was the impetus, maybe is a better way to put it, for this change? Why did everything change? Why did they take a strong left? And Yuri in this article says that he believes that Trump's presidency was the catalyst for much of this, and that they started off kind of going in the wrong direction with Congressman Schiff's Russia collusion allegations. So I'm sure all of you remember the Russian collusion allegations where, basically they said Trump won the election based on collusion with Russia. All that stuff fell apart. You even had folks like the Washington Post and other well-known publications say that this was false. This did not happen in the way that it was proposed. Now, when that story fell apart, the thing was, even when it came to outlets like like NPR, they didn't acknowledge that it happened. They didn't acknowledge that they got anything wrong. Same thing with the Hunter Biden's laptop. When when it did end up being a story and it actually was real, they ignored it and didn't acknowledge there was an issue there. But that's not the only time they did it, and we'll get back into this a little bit deeper too. He says they became fervent members of Team Natural Origin when it came to COVID. They even declared that the lab leak had been debunked by scientists. Now, if you've been listening to us, and we'll talk about this again later, you know that the lab leak is the most likely cause of the pandemic. But they announced that it had been debunked by scientists. Again, it's one thing to do these things and make a mistake. It's another thing not to acknowledge it. And he says they just really weren't acknowledging it. He says at the end of the day, their major issue comes down to this, Chris, a lack of viewpoint diversity. And a Harris poll recently found that 3 in 10 audience members familiar with NPR said they associate NPR with the characteristic of trustworthiness. So only 3 out of 10 people felt that NPR was trustworthy. For a national public news service, a radio service, that's not a good number. Chris, what are your thoughts on what's going on with NPR, and have you ever been a listener?
So I have. I actually got exposed to NPR in my later teenage years. I was being mentored and discipled by Bishop Edward Peacher, and he always had NPR on his radio. It seemed like to me it was always on. So I did start listening myself. In recent time, I have stopped doing that as much. I still check it out because I try to just expose myself to everything, but I go to it for different reasons. I don't go to it. NPR used to be a place that I felt like I could actually go to just to almost decompress a little bit, because there was a sense about NPR that it was, yes, it had that kind of liberal leaning, but it was mostly focused on the beauty of journalism. I think in this article, when I was reading it, he even used that word, beauty, and that's something I used to go to NPR. Like it was chill, and you get some information but now it is just constantly trying to push you in a certain direction. So I don't go to it for that kind of experience. And this point about viewpoint diversity that has been made in this article, I think it's something that we need to look at. I'm glad that this article came out. I think it's something we need to look at in a lot of different domains. When we think about diversity these days, we think primarily about racial and ethnic diversity, which is important, but is not the only kind of diversity, right? Like you can have a lot of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds who all basically have the same worldview, and then you start missing a whole large swath of the conversation. And I would say, I don't know where Yuri's politics are on this, but I get a sense in some of the writing that part of why this article is coming now is because of the viewpoint diversity on the Israel Gaza um, conflict, right? And because he talked about how that same kind of like uh, uh, binary approach to things, good guys versus bad guys, oppressed versus oppressor, how quickly that became the narrative around, the whole Gaza conversation. And an article like this coming forward is something that we would want to see on a regular basis on a whole host of issues at any moment in time.
Right.
Um, but this just, to me, the article itself coming out in this moment highlights the benefit of having people who look at the world and look at different situations from different angles inside of the same institution, especially if that institution is supposed to be a journalistic institution.
That's what I'm saying. It's nice to have in almost every institution, but it's a requirement almost when you're supposed to be a when you're supposed to be about journalism, when you're supposed to be giving people the facts and letting people know what's going on in an unbiased way. And that's just not what's happening. One of the things that I want to acknowledge about NPR's position is when Trump came out, when Trump got some momentum and it looked like he was going to win, or when he was in office, I think it was hard for a lot of people to maintain impartiality.
Yeah,
I think it was hard for a lot of folks to say, just report the facts and let the people move from there, right?
yeah.
So they're not the only ones that fell into it, and even me, I'm like, man, you see the threat, that a Trump brings to the conversation. I don't think you should ignore that. But as a journalist, as a journalistic institution, you just can't do it. Mm-hmm. And there's this hubris that's like, unless we tip the scales, the people just won't understand how bad this is.
Yeah.
You can't be like that as a journalist. Like I've been surprised how many people have openly basically said, in a situation like this, you can't be impartial. And I'm like, you have to be. And you have to trust that Americans, if given the information, right? And we're not saying candy coated information. We're not saying half the information. If given the information, you have to believe that a critical mass of Americans will make the right decision. And maybe sometimes they make the wrong decision. But once you believe that the American people aren't capable of doing that, you no longer believe in democracy. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who talk a lot about democracy, but don't trust the American people at all to make the right decision. And if that's the case, you don't believe in democracy at this point. I mean, that it just is what it is. But go ahead, Chris.
No, I think what you were pointing to is something I've tried to articulate to folks as kind of a concept of institutional integrity, right? Because we say like NPR is a journalism outfit, right? When Trump got elected, I had a consulting firm. We're involved in a lot of advocacy work around education reform. And there were some folks who wanted to do like these rallies and organizing efforts, basically to bring like pro school choice people solidly into the Trump camp. And I'm like, nah, like I'll walk away from the contract before we get involved with some stuff like that. Like it won't happen through us that way. And if you're in an advocacy organization, then you've got leeway to take a side and be like, hey, I'm not down with that cause. I'm going to be against this person. I'm going to be against this issue because I'm in an advocacy organization. If you're in an advocacy organization, people are not looking for that institution to bring them balanced, unbiased information. Right? Like you're looking for a point of view. And I think we've lost this in this kind of like postmodern time where we don't believe as much in institutions, period. Like we've lost this clarity around the role of institutions in the society and what we should be able to expect from different institutions, which is not always the same thing. There used to be a time where if you were working at NPR and you saw the threat of Donald Trump and you wanted to do something about it, what you would do is you would say, I'm leaving NPR and I'm going to go work for this advocacy group. I'm going to work for this campaign because I see this threat. I want to work against it so I'm going to go away from, because I'm not going to change this institution. This institution needs to be balanced, unbiased, play it straight. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to go to an institution where that's not the role of that institution in the society. And the more that we have these breakdowns of institutions and those kind of like boundaries and expectations that we can have from different institutions, and make life so much more like individualistic, I think that it compromises things like journalism in a really, really bad way.
Yeah, I mean, there's just too many professional journalists who think they're doing the right thing by fudging or overemphasizing something Trump did or whatever. You don't need to do. There's enough out there. I've said this so many times. There's enough out there that if people want to go against them, they will. That's their decision to make. It's out there. You don't need to cover up for other people or just all the not talk about a certain subject or not give a certain group credit for this or kind of correction for that. It just doesn't help you. And at the end of the day, you lose trust. And that's very hard to get back. 3 out of 10 people see NPR as trustworthy. That's terrible for a national public radio, situation, man. It's just tough. So the other thing that we see with this though, and I appreciate his admission. It's interesting what kind of sparked him wanting to do this, but it shows you that, again, the media doesn't control what you think, but they can control what you think about.
Yeah.
And when they make a mistake and they don't correct themselves, it's really tough. The other interesting thing is though, Chris, I've been listening to a book about Walter Cronkite, one of his biographies.
Yeah.
And that was one of his main things. Like, the great thing about Walter Cronkite was everybody watched him. So now we watched 20 different people, and we talked about those little bubbles that we're in a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. But everybody watched him for that type of information. What was going on in Vietnam? What was going on with the civil rights movement? They were watching Walter Cronkite. And of course, there were people who complained Nixon had some issues with him or whatever. But in general, people saw him as being very objective and trustworthy. And we all walked away with kind of the same source. Yeah. And that's not happening now, in part because I don't think people are taking the same stance that he took. And guess what? The issues that he was dealing with back then were serious.
Yeah.
Right? But, I think the ethic behind how we go about these things to change. Anything else, Chris?
Yeah, I just would mention what you have at the end of the article about defunding NPR. Like you're mentioning Cronkite. NPR really is one of the sort of last bastions of hope for that kind of like broad journalism. Right. I certainly am in the camp of, like, I would rather see NPR get right than get defunded. Yes. But you open yourself up to those kind of conversations in Congress when only 3% of the people trust you and your coverage is clearly, full of bias.
Yep. There it is, guys. We will be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put it into my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney and the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. Chris, I'll be straight up with you. Until COVID, I don't recall having a whole lot of appreciation for Senator Rand Paul. I think our politics are very different. There was a few things that I might have said, okay, that's not so bad. But in general, it wasn't somebody I looked to and said, I wish there were more politicians like that. Not that I ever thought he completely lacked integrity, but just some of his politics were very different than my own, coming from a more, him coming from a more libertarian point of view, and still have some very serious disagreements. But I will say this, and you know me, Chris, I try to find people with different politics than me and find the good things in what, in what they do, and say, there are folks that I disagree with that may get something right. But I'll say that since COVID, man, I think we all should be thanking him right now, because he has literally spent years trying to get the current administration to release documents exposing what the government did, including a government run by Trump, and what they knew about when it comes to research at the lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We've talked about this several times, guys. The American people have not been told the full truth about what was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And one of the people that has not let it go, because you get the feeling that some folks kind of want to memory hole it, or that, they're hoping that it just kind of fades away and people move on, because I think people are generally, eager to move on from anything connected to COVID. But I will say this, Senator Rand Paul has stayed on the case. And the important part of staying on the case, number one, is so we figure out actually what happened, and hopefully we can prevent it from happening again. So this is not just staying on it just to be a headache. This is actually important to get to the bottom of what happened in this massive pandemic, right? So he wrote an article, and I want to read just part of the article. He says, "How vast was the great COVID cover-up?" Well, he says in his investigation, he has discovered that government officials from 15 federal agencies knew in 2018 that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was trying to create a coronavirus like COVID-19. 15 federal agencies. And these 15 federal agencies with knowledge of this project have continually refused to release any information concerning this alarming and dangerous research. It is crazy. So let me explain something to you guys, just in case you don't know. Any documentation that comes out of the government belongs to the American people. Any information about what's going on, generally the posture is it belongs to the people. So especially when a senator asks for something, a federal agency is supposed to hand it over. Now, there are certain exceptions, and these exceptions should be limited. There's confidential information for one reason or another. But generally, all that information belongs to us. It does not belong to the government. The government works for us. It belongs to us. And you would expect that when a senator asks for it, you would get it, okay? But listen to this. Not one of these 15 agencies, even though they were aware of what was going on, spoke up to warn the American people that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had been pitching this kind of research for a long time. Not one of these agencies warned anybody that this Chinese lab had already put together plans to create this virus. So nobody spoke. Even when all this stuff happened, everybody remained silent that they knew this was going on. It wasn't a secret. All right. And then you have Dr. Anthony Fauci and his National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases was not only briefed on Wuhan's desire to create this virus, briefed on it. It was actually listed as a participant in the initial pitch. It was part of the pitch to get money to do this project, which was about creating a coronavirus like COVID-19. Fauci's Rocky Mountain Lab was named a partner alongside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And here's what I want you to walk away with. All evidence, this is our senator talking right now, all evidence suggests that COVID-19 was a laboratory-enhanced virus purposefully adapted for human transmission. And we had people going around saying that it was racist to say there was a lab leak. We had people getting kicked off of social media. And the whole time, it looks like these folks knew. Dr. Fauci knew. If you have evidence that says the opposite, let me know. But this is where this conversation is. And guess what? It's another one of those things, Chris. Why is nobody talking about this?
Yeah.
This should be one of the, and there's a lot going on, granted, but this should be one of the top 3-4 stories in the nation right now. 15 federal agencies, based on documentation that was just released, knew exactly what was going on in Wuhan. Yet we had people go to hearings and say that wasn't going on. We had people going to hearings and trying to, create all type of smoke and mirrors, and they knew what was happening, which means America and some of our scientists had their hands in this. They were outlawed from doing it in America, so they go over to China and do the same research, and look what happens. Now, I want to be clear. We're not saying anybody did this on purpose, that they meant for it to get out. We're saying they meant to create it, and it ended up getting out. And then there was a cover up because they didn't want the American people to know. Now, this is beyond, you correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, this is beyond a conspiracy theory. This is documented over and over with emails, all type of other things, that this was most likely, all evidence points that it was a lab leak, and that 15 American agencies knew what was going on and didn't say anything. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, there are a couple of things that I want to hone in on, and you mentioned both of them. The first is this withholding of documentation and information that belongs to the American people, and it's one of those pieces that frustrates me with folks who I participate with in different political things. But then when it comes to something, we were all up in arms, a year ago or so about Trump and classified documents and all that type of thing. And at the baseline of that controversy is the fact that President Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, treated documents that belong to the American people like they belong to him. And that is inappropriate because they belong to the American people. Here, you have folks willingly refusing to turn over to an elected United States senator documents that do not belong to them personally, privately, or even departmentally, right? Like those documents belong to the American people, and there should be no reason for those documents to be withheld from an elected United States senator, and that piece of this is really frustrating to me. That you have members of the Senate, members of Congress, who can't get their hands on documents that exist inside the government because those documents don't belong to individuals inside of the government or even departments inside of the government. They belong to the United States and the people of the United States. So that piece is incredibly frustrating. And then, as you said, the lack of coverage and conversation, right? There are certainly a lot of things going on, but there is nothing in our lifetime that has impacted the economy and geopolitics and military readiness and tested presidential competency, like all the things that we're talking about. There is nothing that has had the kind of impact on the world in our lifetimes like COVID-19. And so the idea of getting to the bottom of how we ended up in that pandemic, and more importantly, making sure that we do everything that we possibly can to make sure that we don't end up in a similar situation ever again. Like, to me, that should be top of mind. That should lead the conversation always, because nothing has impacted our world like that, I don't think, in our lifetime. So it's certainly one of the most important things that we could be talking about. And you said something in the last block that I think is worth repeating in this one. The media can't control how you think, but they can control what you think about. And the willful passing over this, because it puts people in a similar situation. I don't want to take us back all the way to the same block, but in order to let the truth come out on what happened with COVID-19, what happened in Fauci's sort of NIH and the broader public health sort of infrastructure and that kind of exploratory science infrastructure, in order to let all that come out, a lot of people are going to have to go through some mea culpas and self-reflection and those types of things. And people don't want to do that. And so they would rather suppress the truth. And that's really unfortunate from the perspective of the discourse, but we also have to pay attention to the seriousness of the actual practical implications of not understanding thoroughly how we got to the place of a global pandemic and make sure that we are able to prevent it from
And what
happening
does it
again.
do with trust in our system for people to be able to even have the option of hiding this in this way, right? To be able to get away with it for years. So if Rand Paul asked for it and he can't get it, I certainly am. We would have never got it, Chris.
Yeah.
We would never came into contact with it. And Rand Paul seems to say that the only reason that he even knew this stuff existed because there was a whistleblower. So if there was no whistleblower, nobody would even know this existed and they wouldn't have to give up anything.
Yeah.
What does that say about our system? And to me, when you hold stuff like this back, that is criminal. People go to jail for a lot of time for things much less than this. And yet nothing will happen. The obvious plan was to let as much time pass as possible and people kind of not be thinking about it. And then you can just kind of smooth it over. Yeah. But this is what people talk about. This is what people are talking about when they're talking about bureaucrats and our agencies, our executive agencies being completely out of control.
Yep.
And what is there to say? What can we even say about the psychology of someone like Fauci who let himself play hero? Who let himself be seen as a hero in the States, knowing, and guys, don't trust me. Go look at the information that's already out there. Say, Justin, you could think Justin don't know nothing he's talking about. The information that's been uncovered through emails and other things have shown very clearly that Fauci knew exactly what happened. Not that he wanted it to happen, not that he wouldn't have tried to prevent it. He knew what happened once it happened, and he misled us. Not only did he mislead the American people, he had other scientists basically say that it wasn't the lab leak when he knew it was the lab leak. Yeah. When he knew what research was going on there, he acted like that research wasn't going on there, and he got to say it in front of Congress under oath. And guess what happens with JoJo if he lies under oath in a courtroom about something that maybe killed nobody or killed a lot less people? He's going to jail, man, for a long time. Yeah. But somehow bureaucrats and folks in DC, it seems, are just under. And this is the crazy thing for us, Chris. I'm going to leave it here. You almost feel like a conspiracy theorist talking about this only because the media won't report on it. It's not like, I mean, the information's out there, but even talking about it, you're like, man, I feel kind of weird because they haven't said a word about. I've never seen anybody, and I don't watch it that often, to be honest, but I've never seen anybody on MSNBC or CNN really call out Fauci when, dude, I don't know. I mean, this is awful. This man knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah, it's completely beyond the pale. And what you allude to is something really important for folks inside the situation to understand, is that hiding is not what it used to be. So it's not perfectly hidden. It's out there a little bit because people are on podcasts and independent media talking about it. And that's why it's destroying trust, because it's not like people don't know what they don't know. There are enough people who know that there's something hidden, something not been discussed and talked about. And so when you have somebody sitting there on these media platforms, the corporate media platforms, ignoring this issue, it is eroding trust, because enough people know that you should be talking about this. And yeah, you might say, well, we can't prove definitively that Fauci knew exactly what happened. It's already been proven definitively that he knew a lot more than he led on, probably enough to say that, again, conspiracy stuff, you got people in Trump world going to jail, like literal jail, for contempt of Congress. And, there's enough evidence to really get close to being able to say definitively that Fauci straight perjured himself under oath in front of Congress. And there's not that same energy. And I'm all about, protecting the integrity of the United States Congress and the United States Congress should be able to subpoena people, and it should matter what you say in front of Congress, no matter who you're with. So I'm not trying to defend anybody who has been held in contempt of Congress. I think that's a real thing. It should be, but we can't have all that energy for one group of people when they lie to Congress or refuse to tell the truth to Congress, and then just totally ignore it when another set of people do the same thing.
Yep, it's tough. But again, for people who care about democracy, for people who say they're trying to save democracy, ignoring something like this is not really helping, and it makes it seem like what you're doing is really just partisan and not really about democracy when you allow stuff like this to happen and you say nothing. We'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put it into my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. A lot has been happening, Chris, when it comes to abortion this week. I don't know if you saw it. The court okayed Arizona's prohibitions on abortion. Carrie Lake, who is the Republican running for Senate, came out against those restrictions. She had earlier supported it, but she'll do whatever the moment calls for. Carrie Lake is not someone I see as having a whole lot of integrity, so she switched positions. She's just trying to win that Senate seat. Trump comes out and really upset a lot of pro-life organizations. Trump comes out and says, hey, I'm not going to do anything to restrict abortion on a national level. It's for the states to decide, right? And I'll be honest with you, a lot of conservative groups were saying that up until right? Like early on, that was actually what a lot of conservatives, that was the position of a lot of conservative groups, okay? That has changed. Dobbs, the Supreme Court, getting rid of Roe changed a lot of different things, all right? So there's a lot going on. But what you and I know, Chris, is that when it comes to elections, abortion right now is probably the Republicans' biggest threat, right? It's the thing that really could sink their ship when it comes to Trump, when it comes to taking back the Senate and all that stuff. So what Trump was doing was he was addressing something that he was like, hey, for the sake of my campaign, I need to get this out the way. How much that works, I'll let you be the judge of that. But listen to this, all right? And this comes from a Gallup poll, and I got sent this earlier this morning. It says that before Dobbs, which is, the Supreme Court decision that got rid of Roe versus Wade, polls suggested that the issue of abortion didn't offer a big political advantage to either party. Most voters favored both significant access to abortion and significant restrictions, which put them to the left of Republican politicians and to the right of Democratic politicians. But Dobbs and the reality of statewide bans, as opposed to the mere prospect of them, altered public opinion. Gallup's polls suggest that almost 10% of Americans on net switched from an anti-abortion position to a position favoring abortion access. After Dobbs, 10% of Americans flip sides on that issue. That is huge. I mean, that is a massive shift in a very short amount of time. Chris, what do you make of that shift, and what do you think it says about the future of the pro-life movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people have to certainly take a step back, take a beat on this, and think about it from a pro-life perspective. Because there's the ethics of abortion, then there's the politics of abortion. You got to find, if you're in politics and working on abortion, you got to find where is the most effective place to be. now as somebody who has been like in and around pro-life conversations pre-Dobbs, one of the things that I used to talk about as somebody who is, I guess, a little bit more comfortable with government existing and having an impact and reach into how society functions, is that if you just say abortion is wrong, let the states decide. To me, there's always been a little bit of incongruence in that logic, because you can't say, if it's murder, you wouldn't say, generally speaking, murder is wrong, so we'll let the states decide. It's when I think about police brutality, I'm not for let the states decide. I think that there needs to be federal legislation that protects citizens in that context, right? Because if you think that something is wrong, you can't just say throw it to the states and whatever they do is going to be okay. So you have to reevaluate that position, and it's a difficult spot for the pro-life movement. It's a difficult spot for the Republican Party, which has been the party that I guess has most embraced the pro-life movement pre-Dobbs. But there should have been a much longer conversation. I am surprised to see that it seems to me like how little thought has gone into like what is a sort of national solution that is politically palatable, that can be a position that folks can work toward. I guess maybe politically throw it to the states is as good as Republican Party can do right now. But if I think that this is something that the pro-life movement and pro-life people, right? Because I think that there are a lot of pro-life people who don't consider themselves part of the pro-life movement too. But there are. This is something that folks need to step back and look at. On the politics, I'm going to maybe take a little bit of a step out onto a branch here, Justin. But I think that on the politics, the impact is maybe getting to the point where it's a little bit overblown. I do think immediately after Dobbs, we underestimated the impact. But I think with the quick shift, we've got to a place where we overestimate, because I think it's very unlikely that even an issue as potent as abortion is actually making somebody who's going to vote Republican, making a whole lot of people who are going to vote Republican go vote Democrat. That's going to be a much smaller swath of the electorate. And my question would be, and I haven't seen a ton of polling on this, how many of those people have abortion as their top issue or a single issue? Because that's really what's going to matter on the motivation factor. And I don't think, especially given Gaza and age and all that stuff, I don't know that this issue swings enough people to that side. And this New York Times article, I did find this a New York Times article this morning talking about it. They actually look at this. There's certainly been some impact, and it's been hard for Republicans. But when you actually look at the outcomes on elections, there've been some high points that folks have highlighted, but you haven't seen any governors lose, re-election. Republican governors lose re-election over abortion. You haven't seen any
It's been
senators.
mostly special election stuff, right?
Yeah, you have. So this larger. I mean, the presidential election is as big as elections get, and there's so many more issues at play. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that other issues are going to have equal, if not more, impact on this election than abortion, because I think that people care, but I still don't think either side has moral high ground. I don't think either side has the kind of message clarity and salience that some folks might think.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's going to be interesting. If I'm the Democrats, I'm making a big, hey, you can't let this guy put somebody else on the Supreme Court if you care, if you care about what some would call access to abortion. Obviously, we're an organization who believes in the sanctity of life, but that's what I would expect the Democrats to be saying and just really hitting that home, because even if you let him in for 4 more, whoever he keeps putting on this Supreme Court is going to be in for a lot longer than that. I expect that to be the argument that's made. Could hit home with some people. we'll see. We'll see what happens. Obviously, it's some level of a threat because he did address it and he made a lot of his base upset, or at least Christian conservative, the religious right, upset by what he came out and said. What was surprising to me was that folks were acting like they were surprised that he would that he would do something like that, and it was like, come on, guys.
Yeah, and that's the other thing on the politics. Trump is going to be able to pivot to the center a lot more easily without losing his base than Biden will be.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I am certainly interested to see. I'm watching. I will say that I did underestimate the impact of Dobbs on elections in those first elections out of the gate.
Yeah.
But
I got that wrong too. I'm pretty sure on this show I said I don't think the impact will be that great, but it was. I mean, you're looking at Kansas, you're looking at Ohio. There was a backlash.
Yeah, there was certainly a backlash, and the backlash does exist in those white suburban voters, which became the battleground, the battle lines in the previous presidential election. I still think I would argue that we were more right than in those particular communities about how I still don't see like folks in the inner city, Black folks, Latino folks who are dealing with so many clear and present issues that are, everybody in the community is impacted when the economy's bad, when groceries cost too much, when crime is run amok. And you have to have a certain level of basic comfort for abortion to become the number one issue. And I just don't know that outside of those sort of middle class suburban communities that this issue is still like jumping to number 1 or 2 on a lot of people's list. Now, those suburbs have been where the last 2 presidential elections have played out. But with the election so close, I think the dynamics in the urban center and the competing motivations with issues around the economy, competency, all those types of things, it'll be very interesting. I'm willing to say here, and if I get it wrong, I'll just come back and say I got it wrong. But I'm willing to say here that it might be that we look back and see that it was a little bit overblown in terms of how much it will impact the presidential.
We shall see. Well, as always, Chris, it's a pleasure to be going back and forth with you. We got one more segment, though, for those who are our patrons and have been going to Patreon and helping us out there. So y'all got another segment coming up. For everybody else. And Camp, you know that there's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, and Camp, we'll holla at you.
Dear Lord, pay for my sins, Lord. I'm black as heaven. Amen.